What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh format guide. And today we're diving into Critter format, which is the second sort of historical format that people actually play, following pretty much right after Yugi-Kaiba format. So what is Critter format? Well, after, Legend of Blue Eyes booster pack released, and then the Starter X Yugi and Kaiba, and after they put into place that limited list, which made Yugi-Kaiba format, a new booster pack was released called Metal Raiders. Metal Raiders added a ton of new meta warping cards to the format that really changed the way the game is played. Now, when Metal Raiders was first released, there wasn't a limited list restricting how you could play with any of the cards in the set. So there was a brief period of time where you could play, basically with the Yugi-Kaiba format limited list and the Metal Raiders cards added to the card pool, which, let's call that MRD format. So you might wonder why I'm not covering MRD format right now and instead jumping straight to Critter, which is basically when they added a second updated limited list to restrict the use of some cards from Metal Raiders. After all, this channel has covered LOB format, SDYK format, both of which are formats that aren't really played, but, they take the card pool that was released at the time and wonder what happened if people played this without a limited list, because the limited list wasn't incorporated until after those card sets were released. So why am I not covering MRD format right now? Well, I think that unlike LOB format and STYK format, which I think are pretty vastly different from Yugi-Kaiba format, MRD format is a lot more similar to Critter format. I'm pretty sure. I haven't extensively tested this, but I think that, not having the Critter format limited list, it bolsters certain decks in Critter, it weakens certain other decks in Critter, but I think overall it doesn't make like a tier 0 metagame or shift things up too much. Or at least not to the same degree that limiting all the powerful spell cards in LOB and Starter Deck Yugi and Kaiba did. So since Critter format is actually decently played, whereas no one really plays MRD format, I'm going to be focusing on Critter format first on the channel, and then at the end of Critter format, after getting to know its decks and the way it's played, I will then look back to quote-unquote MRD format and discuss how not having the limited list affects things. Because I don't think there are any new decks that are made viable by not having the limited list. So we should just be able to view MRD format through a lens of Critter decks. But we're not talking about MRD format right now. We're talking about Critter format. So let's dive in to some of the major new cards that got introduced in Critter that really warped the way the game was played before actually diving into the limited list, because we'll need to know what these cards are before seeing what cards got limited, because, spoiler alert, some of the cards on the screen right now are some of the ones that got limited and semi-limited by that list. Another note before we begin is that while I'm going to make this video as beginner-friendly as possible, I think that it would help if you had a basic rudimentary knowledge of, the basic cards that are commonly used in Yugi-Kaiba format, because I will be referring to those quite a bit. So if you haven't seen my videos on Yugi-Kaiba format or are unfamiliar with it, then I've got tons of resources for that format, so feel free to check them out. Hopefully, you won't be too lost if you don't know that stuff, but if you do, definitely check those out, because I think they'll probably help a lot. Anyways, after all that preamble, let's dive in to the new cards that actually make Critter format unique. I think that each of these really early Yu-Gi-Oh formats has their own sort of set of core cards, which are cards that pretty much every deck is going to use, or cards that, really define the metagame, and so should be known about, even if you're not using them in your deck. Of course, given all the powerful cards in Yugi-Kaiba format, a certain amount of the cards in Critter format are going to be the same as those in Yugi-Kaiba format. For instance, Lodge-In is still a super powerful beater in this format. 1800 is the highest attack on a level 4 monster that doesn't have certain negative side effects to attacking, which I'll get into those later. But since this is just sort of a generic attacker, it's still widely played in the format. So, you know, when comparing other monsters, it's always good to compare their stat lines to 1800 attack. Likewise, 2K defenders like Giant Soldier of Stone are still the gold standard when it comes to level 4 or lower defensive monsters. So a lot of decks are still playing at least a couple copies of these walls. Although there are other monsters that you might want to set if you think that you're going to be attacked. And of course, all the powerful spell cards pretty much from last format are still going to be relevant. So of course, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Red Geki are all going to be great. Fissure is still great removal, even if there are other removal options in this format now. So it can still definitely pop up. And Swords is still okay at stalling, although there are some cards in this format that make Swords a lot worse than it was in Yugi-Kaiba format. For the traps, Trap Hole is still a great card, although it is not quite as good as it maybe once was in Yugi-Kaiba format. It still sees a fair amount of play. And Waboku is, of course, just still a great defensive tool, one of the best defensive traps in the game, so that still sees a lot of play as well. Now, that's not to say that all the core cards from last format are still widely played anymore. These 1700 beaters like Battle Ox do get sort of outclassed by some of the new monsters that come in this set, so they've largely fallen out of favor in this format. Maneater Bug, while still decently good, has gotten a lot worse in this format due to certain other flip monsters just being better, and also certain monsters not really caring if they are destroyed. So Maneater Bug isn't the best, although I think it still does see play potentially in side decks or in certain decks that, you know, just really want to clear your opponent's field. But I think it's much more rare to see in this format than it was in Yugi-Kaiba. And Reinforcements as well, I think, has gotten a lot less good. There are better battle traps in the format, and the actual physical attacks of the monsters don't really matter as much in this format as they did in Yugi-Kaiba format. It's not to say that they don't matter, because they definitely do, but it matters a bit less. So this definitely sees a bit less play than it did in the last format. But why do things like attack buffs matter less in this format? Why are there monsters that actually benefit from being destroyed by Maneater Bug? Well, to answer these questions, we've got to dive into the new cards of the format. The new sort of core cards that I think are incredibly powerful and that everyone should know about. And what better one to start off with than Sangan? Sangan, which is known as Critter in the original Japanese name of this card, is one of the best effect monsters in the format now, and one of the main reasons why this format is so different. Basically what it does is, when it is sent from the field to the graveyard, you get to add one monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand. Now, you might notice that there is additional text on this card here on Dueling Book that says you can't activate cards or the effective cards with that name for the rest of the turn, and that you can only use this effective Sangan once per turn. Those are all sort of restrictions that were added on later in the game's history. So they went back and changed Sangan's effect because it was just too strong. In Critter format, we play with the original version of the card's text, which doesn't have all this restriction, which means that you can activate the effective Sangan multiple times in a turn if you trigger it multiple times. And also, you can use the effects of monsters that you add from your deck to your hand that turn. You know, you don't need to wait until the next turn. Sangan also has an arguably more powerful counterpart, Witch of the Black Forest, which does a very similar thing. It says, if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, add one monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand. And then, just like Sangan, it's got all these restrictions on it. But at this point in the game's history, those were not there. So they're not played with in critter format, which means you can activate the effect of Witch multiple times per turn if you manage to trigger it multiple times per turn, and you can activate the effects of monsters that you add from your deck to your hand with Witch the turn that they are added. The effect of these two cards on the game cannot be understated. In Yugi-Kaiba format, there was no real way to search your deck for a card and add it to your hand. You had to rely solely on drawing the cards that you needed over the course of the game. Here, however, you can turn your deck into basically a toolbox for whatever given thing that you need at a given time. Do you need a big attacker to get off of Witch? Well, maybe you could search a Login, to beat down an opponent's monster if you need it. Do you need instead to go a bit more defensive? Well, Sandgane can search you out a Giant Soldier of Stone. And these are just basic stats that we're searching for here. We're not even getting into the other powerful effect monsters that we're going to cover very soon. So these two cards are insanely good and insanely meta-warping, and they completely shift the way the game is played. But they're not the only cards that shift the way the game is played in Critter format. Critter format also introduces some incredibly powerful flip effect monsters. So the first of those is Magician of Faith. Magician of Faith is a flip effect monster that lets you target one spell in your graveyard and add that target to your hand when Magician of Faith is flipped face up. This can just be insanely strong. So, I talked about how last format, these limited spell cards were just insanely good, and a lot of the game was warped around okay, which of these powerful 5 spell cards has my opponent used so far? Which do they still have left in deck? I need to play around what they have left in deck, and I don't need to worry about what they've used. Magician of Faith completely changes that, because after using one of these powerful spell cards, Magician of Faith, if you manage to get its effect off, lets you get that powerful spell card back. And that can just be insanely strong. And that's not even considering that there's another super powerful spell card that got added to the game as well with this set, which I'll get to very soon. So Magician of Faith, incredibly good. Not every deck plays this card, but you have to know about it being in the format, because if you don't reckon for its power, then you could get majorly punished by not playing around certain powerful spells that Magician of Faith can get back. A card with a very similar effect, although slightly less powerful depending on what deck you're playing, is Mask of Darkness. Now, Mask of Darkness is a flip effect monster, just like Magician of Faith. That flip effect reads, target one trap in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. Now, while this can't get back a powerful spell like Magician of Faith can, there are some very powerful traps that got introduced in this format that Mask of Darkness can bring back that can be incredibly good to get back to hand. I'll get to those slightly later. Now, this may not seem that impressive if you're just thinking of the traps that were in Yugi-Kaiba format, but Critter format introduces some very powerful new traps that Mask of Darkness can get back, making it a card that you should also know about being in the format, even if your deck doesn't necessarily want to run it. In addition to these powerful flip effect monsters, Critter also introduced some very powerful monsters that can really influence the card advantage that both players have. The first of those monsters is Masked Sorcerer. Now, Masked Sorcerer is a monster with stats that might seem kind of lacking. It's only got 900 attack and 1400 defense, but its effect is absolutely insane. So, when Mask of Darkness inflicts battle damage to your opponent's life points, you get to draw one card. This may seem pretty innocuous at first, but if you're able to clear your opponent's board of monsters, protect your Masked Sorcerer from destruction, and actually get in a couple attacks with this card, that can be completely insane and completely swing the outcome of the game. Honestly, even if you only get in one attack with Masked Sorcerer, that's still incredibly good, as even one draw can be very important in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a game where card advantage matters a lot, and Masked Sorcerer just allows you to get more, and that makes it an incredibly good card. Its 1400 defense is actually not as bad as it first seems as well, as oftentimes, people are playing weaker monsters like Sandgane and Witch, so if they do attack into a Masked Sorcerer with a Sandgane and Witch, then you'll be able to draw a card off of that as well, as this effect doesn't only apply when it attacks, it's just when it inflicts battle damage in general. So Math Sorcerer is an incredibly good card, and in fact there are decks based around this effect called Masked Control, basically, which we'll get into later. On the flip side, we also have White Magical Hat, and just like Math Sorcerer, the stats on this card are not too impressive, only 1000 attack, 700 defense, but when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, then your opponent discards one card randomly from their hand, which can be just crazy. If your opponent is holding onto a powerful card in their hand to use later, and you're able to discard it from their hand with White Magical Hat, that can be incredibly punishing. And so this card is also very good to know about and maybe play around. You know, if you're worried that your opponent might be able to get in with a White Magical Hat attack on the next turn, maybe set a spell or trap card that you're trying to save for later in the game. That isn't foolproof, as we'll see very soon, but it's a card that you should know about. And both of these cards you should know about and play around, you know. You don't want your opponent to be able to actually attack in and hit you with either one of these, no matter what deck you're playing. Now, the last new monster that I'm going to talk about may seem a bit unimpressive, given the power and meta warping capabilities of the previous monsters that I mentioned, but 7-Colored Fish is an important card to talk about. So, 7-Colored Fish, it's a normal monster with 1800 attack. Instantly, all the 1700 attack beat sticks are power crept by this card, basically. As I mentioned before when discussing Login, Metal Raiders did also introduce some monsters with even more attack than 1800, but those have some downsides to them. 7-Colored Fish, no downsides, it's just basically additional copies of Login. And as we saw last format with things like Umi Beatdown trying to play more copies of Login, having additional copies of an 1800 beater can be very useful. So this sees play in a lot of decks that want to go a bit more aggressive potentially. While the monsters are a big part of what makes this format so different from Yugi-Kaiba format, the spells and traps are nothing to scoff at either, especially Heavy Storm. Now, Heavy Storm is arguably more meta warping than any of the monsters are, because Heavy Storm says, destroy all spell and trap cards on the field. This is absolutely insane in the context of Yugi-Kaiba format. Because in Yugi-Kaiba format, you could generally set all your spells and traps without worrying about them being destroyed. Sure, there were things like Trap Master and D-Spell that could deal with them, and decks like Back Row Control, whose whole point was to get rid of back row. But those decks were sort of niche, and those cards have sort of fallen out of favor in the modern Yugi-Kaiba metagame. So basically, you can often set your whole hand of spells and trap cards in Yugi-Kaiba format without worrying about those cards being destroyed. Heavy Storm changes all that. Now, if you overcommit to cards in your back row, you can be majorly punished by an opponent's Heavy Storm, just wiping them all out. Now, there is counterplay to this card in this format, one of which I will talk about very soon, but you're not going to always have access to that counterplay. And if you set your whole hand, your opponent might read into it that you have that counterplay and play around your counterplay. So Heavy Storm adds an entirely new dynamic to setting back row and critter that there just wasn't in Yugi-Kaiba format. And it's just an incredibly, incredibly good card. In addition to Heavy Storm, we also have the card that's probably punished most by Heavy Storm, and that's Mirror Force. Now, Mirror Force is a card that basically changes the way the battle phase is conducted. So it is also incredibly meta warping. Basically, the trap that reads, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy all your opponent's attack position monsters. That is insanely good if you manage to pull it off, and your opponent has a bunch of monsters in attack position. Sure, if the monsters that they have in attack are like Witch and Sangan, then they do get cards off of it. But you've managed to clear their entire field of monsters if they're all in attack. Which means that when people are attacking now, they can't necessarily go as all in as they once could have. Now, Mirror Force isn't quite as good as the other cards that I've talked about so far, in my opinion. Partially because Heavy Storm is a great way to deal with a Mirror Force if you have the read that your opponent has a Mirror Force set. And partially because the limited list, which I'll cover soon, also really, limits the use of this card. But it's still a great card to play in pretty much every deck, because if you manage to pull off its effect, it's just incredibly good. And also, you can get it back with something like Mask of Darkness if you really need to. But in terms of traps, I think there's one that's even more meta-defining than Mirror Force, and that's Solemn Judgment. Now, Solemn Judgment is one of a series of traps that were released in Metal Raiders known as counter traps, and they're indicated by this little arrow symbol up right after the trap card thing here, and they completely changed the way the game is played. I know I've said that like 5 times already in this video, but it really is true. Solemn Judgment and the other counter traps in this set are the first instance in the game history of cards having effects that are able to negate other effects. What does that mean? It just means that, you know, your opponent doesn't get to do the thing that they wanted to do. So, you know, if they activate Heavy Storm and you activate Solemn Judgment, that Heavy Storm will not get to resolve its effect and will just be sent to the graveyard without destroying all spells and traps on the field. Solemn Judgment is the best of these counter traps because it reads when a monster or monsters would be summoned or a trap or spell card is activated. Pay half your life points, negate the summoner activation, and if you do, destroy that card. So it's got the most utility because it can stop both monsters being summoned and also stop the activation of spell and trap effects. And something interesting to note is that counter traps can be activated in the damage step. So if your opponent is activating reinforcements, then you can actually activate Solemn Judgment in response. Which means that things like reinforcements, which were so strong in the last format because they could be basically unresponded to except by another copy of reinforcements, now do have a counter in the form of counter trap cards. There are some other good counter trap cards that I think could see play in the format and potentially do see play in the format. But Solemn Judgment is the one that you have to look out for because even though it has a very steep cost of paying half your life points, its utility, being able to counter multiple types of things, just gives it an edge over all the other counter traps, and it is widely played, especially in more control-y sorts of decks or stall decks. And those are the new sort of like quote-unquote core cards that were introduced in this format. Now, there are some other cards that do see a lot of play in more niche strategies, and there are some other cards in Metal Raiders that, like 7-Colored Fish, could be played for their stats. For instance, Prevent Rat is another 2k defender, but given that, you know, its attack is weaker than the other 2k defenders in the format, there's no real reason to play it over the ones that were in Yugi-Kaiba format. So I'm not going to dive in to all the different, you know, new normal monsters that were introduced in the set that could potentially be played, as I think that's kind of a waste of time. But these are the big, you know, cards to watch out for, cards to definitely know about if you're only going to go into this format casually. These are the things that you need to know. Now that we've covered the core cards and gotten some context for how this format differs from Yugi-Kaiba, let's cover the Critter Limited list. So the Critter Limited list is actually pretty similar to the Yugi-Kaiba format limited list. So we of course have all the pieces of Exodia Limited, largely for lore reasons, but there are actually some important other reasons, especially in Critter format, as we'll get into. Exodia is actually a somewhat decent deck in this format. So it's actually very relevant that these are all limited to 1 copy. Of course, also all the Power 5 spell cards here are all limited to 1 copy. Change of Heart, Darkhold, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki. They're all just too incredibly strong to play in multiple copies. We also have one more new limited card on this list, which is Mirror Force. Now, if I was to limit any card in Metal Raiders, I'm not necessarily sure that I'd pick Mirror Force. I'd honestly maybe pick Heavy Storm, as Mirror Force there are ways to play around, and also Heavy Storm is a pretty good counter to it. But I understand why they limited Mirror Force. It's a very powerful trap when it actually goes off, and so it is limited here. I think this does hamper the card's power a bit, but, you know, I think that every deck should play Mirror Force at 1 copy, because why not? Now, the semi-limited list is where there's actually a lot of new cards added. Both Sangan and Witch are limited to 2 copies, which I think is a good thing. Having 3 of each in the deck just adds too much consistency to some of the most powerful decks in the format, and can just also enable silly sort of stally things where, you know, Sangan goes into Sangan, goes into Sangan, goes into Witch, goes into Witch, goes into Witch, and you just get an endless conga line of monsters coming to your hand, which can have its degenerate uses. So I think that putting both of these at 2 copies is probably a good thing, and maybe they could have even dropped it down to 1. But they chose to put each at 2. Of course, just like last format, Card Destruction is still at 2 copies, and I think the Stall Mill is a lot worse of a deck in Critter format than it was in Yugi-Kaiba. So I'm not sure how relevant this actually is, but it's probably better to have it at 2 than to have it at 3, because this card can be very degenerate if it's allowed to get out of hand. We also have Heavy Storm, limited to 2 copies. Again, as I said, I think that this could have just been limited down to 1, but having 2 copies in the format definitely makes things pretty interesting, because it makes it more likely that your opponent could draw heavy. So you have to play around it a bit more. And also, we have Swords Revealing Light, limited to 2 copies as well. I honestly think this could probably be unlimited, given that Heavy Storm is in the format, and Heavy Storm can just destroy Swords Revealing Light out of nowhere. Swords is still a powerful spell card if your opponent doesn't have Heavy, or if you've got like Solemn Judgments or things to back up the Swords. So I understand why it's semi-limited, although I think it probably could have been taken off this list. But that's Critter's limited list. As I've said, I don't think it's that different from Yugi-Kaiba format's limited lists. And as such, I actually don't think that a Metal Raiders format without this limited list would be super, super different. Although I do think that, you know, having Mirror Force at 3 copies, having Sangan and Witch at 3 copies as well, could bolster certain stall strategies while weakening more aggressive strategies. But I'll dive into all that analysis when I eventually cover Metal Raiders format at the end of my Critter format coverage. For now, this is the list for Critter format that defines pretty much the game's meta. But we've talked about, you know, the best cards in general for all these sorts of decks. We haven't really talked about the sort of decks that can be made in this format. So let's dive into those real quickly. Now, there are a couple different directions that you can go with these decks, so let's tackle all those different directions one by one and see what unique tools they have to their name. While it's not the most commonly represented strategy in the format, Beatdown is still a viable direction that you can go, and it actually got a lot of tools to help it out in Metal Raiders. So I already mentioned 7-Colored Fish being another copy of Lodgin, basically with 1800 attack, and of course Lodgin is still a great tool. But there are some monsters that outclass both of them in the pure aggression department. The biggest one is Jurai Gumo. Jurai Gumo is a monster with 2200 attack on level 4 monster, which is insane. This card can get over your opponent's 2k defenders with ease. However, it's got a bit of a risk to it. Its effect reads, when this card declares an attack, toss a coin and call it. If you call it wrong, lose half your life points. That's a super steep price to pay. Now, of course, this alone will never kill you because, you know, half of a very small amount of life points is still not 0. But it can get you within easy range of death, especially if your opponent's also on a more aggressive strategy, or on a burn strategy, which we'll cover as well. So this is a very risky card to play. Of course, you're not always going to have to pay those life points, but even half the time, if you're paying half your life points each attack, it can be very bad. But you could argue that the benefits outweigh the risk, especially given this can get over so much in the format. And if it does directly attack your opponent, 2200 is a lot of damage. So this is a card that can definitely see a fair amount of play if you want to go more aggressive. Similarly, Dark Elf is a level 4 monster with over 1800 attack. Dark Elf has 2000 attack, and its effect reads, this card requires the cost of 1000 of your own life points to attack. Kind of weirdly worded, But basically what it means is that you have to pay 1,000 life points every time this attacks, and if you can't pay that 1,000, this card can't attack. This, in my opinion, makes it a fair bit worse than Jiraigumo, because while Jiraigumo does require you to pay a higher life point cost, oftentimes, it can always attack at least, whereas Dark Elf, if you're below a certain threshold, you can't attack. Also, when you get low enough, Dark Elf's cost could be a lot more than Jiraigumo's. And also, Dark Elf can't get over like a 2k defender like Giant Soldier Stone on its own. So, I personally think that Dark Elf is a bit worse than Jiraigumo, but I know a lot of these sort of aggressive decks do play both, and it can just be incredibly strong if you're able to attack directly with a Dark Elf, getting in for 2,000. That's a fourth of your opponent's life points. So, a pretty good aggressive tool as well. I figure I should also mention here Muka Muka, although Muka Muka oftentimes doesn't see play as much in aggressive decks, but in more controlling decks. And here's why. Muka Muka on its own is just a 600 attack point monster, which does not seem like the best aggressive tool. But it gains 300 attack and defense for each card in your hand, which can get out of hand awfully quickly if you're playing a control deck that is able to draw a bunch of cards with things like Masked Sorcerer. Also, you know, if you just open up the game, 6 cards in hand, Muka Muka's in hand, summon out Muka Muka, set 1 pass, Muka Muka has 1800 attack there, which is the equivalent of a 7-colored fish and Login. So Muka Muka can just be an aggressive beast stick on its own if you play it early enough, or if you just, you know, play with it in mind and play it when you have a pretty big hand. It's also an aggressive threat that can be searched off of Sangan, which is pretty nice. Although, on that note, all of these aggressive threats can be searched with, like, Witch of the Black Forest, but Muka Muka is the only one that can actually be searched with both Sangan and Witch. So it's got that sort of niche application as well. But generally, Muka Muka sees less play in these sorts of really aggressive beatdown strategies and more play in control strategies, which we'll get to later. I will note there's also another level 4 monster with 1800 attack in the form of the Bistro Butcher, but this card is really bad, and I would not recommend playing it outside of some maybe very jank stall mill decks, I guess. And basically what it does is when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent's life points, your opponent draws 2 cards from their deck. On the surface, this maybe doesn't seem as bad a cost as something like Jiraigumo, because you're preserving your life points, you know, and you're getting in a fair bit of damage with this card. But 2 cards can mean a lot in this format, especially given how much this format relies on card advantage. And given that, Bistro Butcher, honestly, in my opinion, has the worst cost of all 3 of these sorts of attack monsters with detriments. On top of that, it's only got 1800 attack, which means that instead of playing this, you could just play a 7-colored fish or Login. So, I think the Bistro Butcher, not very good. Its draw 2 effect can have applications in mill decks, as I said. You know, you attack in with Bistro Butcher, your opponent draws 2 additional cards. You fire off a bunch of card destructions and can potentially mill them out very quickly in that manner. But I think outside of those sorts of decks, this card is not very good and should not be played in most beatdown strategies. I will also bring up one more monster in this set, which is Shadow Ghoul. And Shadow Ghoul, you know, it's a 1 tribute monster with only 1600 attack to start out, but it gains 100 attack for each monster in your graveyard. So, if you get enough monsters in your graveyard, this thing can get pretty big. However, that's a bit of a tall ask, especially because the gold standard for 1 tribute monsters is Summon Skull, which has 2500 attack points. To get Shadow Ghoul up to 2500, you've got to get 9 monsters in graveyard, which is a bit tough. Maybe if Sangan and Witch were at 3 copies each, this would be a little bit easier. But it's a big ask, and you're getting a pretty marginal benefit when all's said and done, because even if you can get this thing up over a Summon Skulls attack, you're only going to get it up by a marginal amount. So we'll be able to attack over Summon Skull potentially, but is it really worth playing over Summon Skull? Especially given the additional removal that this set has. I'm of the opinion no. But Shadow Ghoul could make for the basis of a fun sort of jank deck. So I will put it in here in the aggro strategy section if you want to experiment with it. Moving on to the spells, this set also introduced some equip spells that pretty much outclass everything that was in the last format. Last format equip spells topped out at 400 attack at best, and they were conditional, so the monsters had to satisfy certain requirements to get equipped to. Here we've got equip spells that are unconditional and boost for more than 400 attack, so they're a bit better. Firstly, we have Sword of Deep-Seated. This card is just, the equipped monster gains 500 attack and defense. Instantly better than Sword of Direct Destruction and Invigoration. However, this card does have a slight downside, although it could be viewed as an upside, I guess. If it is sent to the graveyard, you place it on top of your deck. Now you might think, wow, this is great. I just keep getting it back. I can keep equipping it to my monsters. My opponent can never get rid of this card. Well, the issue is if you're low on cards and your opponent destroys Sword of Deep-Seated and puts it back on top of your deck, you basically lose an additional draw because you have to redraw the Sword of Deep-Seated. Sure, you get it back into hand, but you might have wanted a different card as opposed to just an equipped card that your opponent knows about. And if you don't have any additional monsters in hand, then it's just a useless draw. So that can make it kind of unfortunate. That being said, the place it on top of your deck effect can have some benefits, because if you're playing against Stall Mill, this card basically invalidates that strategy because you'll never be able to deck out. Whenever this is sent to the graveyard, you just redraw it. So, your opponent could just kill you through attacking if this is the only card you have left to your name. But, it does prevent the deck out win condition of Stall Mill. So, something to keep in mind. The equip card that I think is a little bit better than Sword of Deep-Seated in this format is Stimpak. Now, Stimpak, it says the equipped monster gains 700 attack, which is insane. It's even bigger than Sword of Deep-Seated. It does have a downside that during each of your standby phases, the equipped monster loses 200 attack. But honestly, if this lasts long enough to become a detriment to you, you're still feeling pretty good because you've had a monster on field that's been buffed for a while, and it's probably even putting in a fair amount of work. Heck, even after the first decrease, this is still on par with a Sword Deep-Seated in terms of attack gain. So that's very good. And the fact that it's generic as well is just even better. So Stimpak, I think, is a great aggressive tool in this format. Now, I will say equip spells do have the weakness of dying to Heavy Storm. But, if you're just using them as sort of removal options, like your opponent has a defender up, you equip a Stimpak to your monster to get over that defender, it's gone basically 1-for-1. And if your opponent has to use another card to remove it, then that gets rid of an additional card. So if you're viewing the card in that light, it can be pretty good. Oftentimes you won't be able to get these equipped cards to stick around for too long. But if you can get them to stick around for a while and accomplish what you need to get done in the moment, then that's honestly good enough. These aggressive tools can be very good at getting your opponent to a very low amount of life very quickly. And that may be why, these cards aren't often played in a pure beatdown sort of strategy. They're often played in conjunction with another sort of strategy that also received some major support in Metal Raiders. So let's talk about that now. Burn may have received less support in Metal Raiders than Beatdown and Control did, but the support that it did receive is really good, and can be combined with things like an aggro shell to just finish off your opponent out of nowhere. So let's dive in to the cards themselves and see how they can do that. Firstly, we have Cannon Soldier. Cannon Soldier, very simple. It's a 1400 attack point monster, and it just says you contribute one monster, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. Important things to note, that's not once per turn, so you can activate this effect multiple times per turn. You could even, turn it into a silly sort of combo where you have something like Ultimate Offering up on the field, you bring out a Sangan and a Cannon Soldier, tribute off the Sangan with the Cannon Soldier, use the Sangan to search a Sangan, bring out the Sangan, tribute it off with the Cannon Soldier, Sangan searches Witch, bring out Witch, tribute Witch, you can see where this is going. And that can deal basically 3,000 damage out of nowhere if your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with it. which can be very strong. However, even if you're not doing a full crazy combo with this card, it can still just be very, very good, being able to deal 500 or 1,000 damage out of nowhere, you know? With things like Jiraiya, Dark Elf, just these huge beaters being able to attack into your opponent's life points, they can get down to a very low total very quickly, and Cannon Soldier can just deal the last bit of chip damage that you need to finish them off. I will also say that, you know, being able to trigger things like Sangan or Witch can be very valuable as well. Being able to search out things like Catapult Turtle or Princess Tsurugi, you know, the other powerful burn monsters in the format. Or being able to search out things like Magician of Faith or Mask of Darkness to get back your powerful burn spells or traps. I mean, Cannon Soldier's just got a lot of utility, and I think it's a really cool card that really helps out burn a lot. A similar card to Cannon Soldier is Catapult Turtle. Now, you may look at Catapult Turtle's effect that's on screen here and may not think it's anything special. It says once per turn, you contribute one monster, inflict damage to your opponent equal to half the attributed monster's attack on the field. So you might wonder, you know, why is this good? I mean, sure, attributing one monster on your turn is okay, but is this really as good as something like Cannon Soldier? Well, something to consider is that Catapult Turtle's effect is actually not quite what it is here. Just like Sangan and Witch, Catapult Turtle's effect was altered later on in the game's history to make the card less broken. Initially, this was not once per turn, which actually can make this a lot better. Let's say that you have a board that's like Jiraiya and Dark Elf, and you've been able to get in for a ton of damage over the course of the game. If you can bring out a Catapult Turtle, maybe tributing off Dark Elf, tribute off Jiraiya, that's 1,100 more damage, maybe activate a Last Will, you know, bring out another monster that you can tribute off of Catapult Turtle, that's a little bit more damage, and then Catapult Turtle contribute itself as well, which is just 500 more damage. And all that damage that Catapult Turtle's dealing could just finish off your opponent right there. So Catapult Turtle is extremely good as well, especially in decks that use Last Will to bring it out. I think that Cannon Soldier has more general utility than Catapult Turtle does, but Catapult Turtle can pump out a lot more damage than Cannon Soldier can in one turn, potentially. So it's another option for these sorts of burn strategies. Another pretty good burn card is Princess Tsurugi. Now, Princess Tsurugi is a flip monster that's effect reads: inflict 500 points of damage to your opponent's life points for each spell and trap card on your opponent's side of the field. Given the heavy storm is in the format, people generally don't overcommit to back row, so this is maybe less good than it would be in Yugi-Kaiba format, but it's still a pretty decent effect. Oftentimes your opponent will have a couple back row set, and if they set like a Solemn Judgment to play around heavy, and they're forced to use it, bringing their life points down to 4,000, you then set Princess of Tsurugi as follow-up, and burn them for potentially like 1,000. That's pretty good. It probably won't win you the game, but that's still pretty good, and it can be a bit of a punish for your opponents who are overcommitting to back row. And that does it for the good burn monsters. There is also one more monster that can do a bit of burn in the format, and that's Mushroom Man number 2. Mushroom Man number 2 is a pretty bad card. Basically, it reads: the controller of this monster takes 300 damage during each of their standby phases. During your end phase, you can pay 500 life points to shift control of this card to your opponent. Very unique effect in the format. Absolutely terrible, though. This is basically a card that says, pay 500 to deal your opponent 300. I mean, it's okay. If your opponent's very low on life points, I guess it's something. But given that tribute monsters exist, they can just tribute over Mushroom Man number 2. Bring out like a Summoned Skull. You're just giving them a free monster. And like, is 300 damage really worth it? 300 is less than, you know, even Hinotama, which already is bad enough to see no play. So, I mean, I guess the fact that Mushroom Man number 2 is a monster can make it slightly better because you can attack in with it first. But this card is just really bad. I put it in here for completeness, but I don't recommend ever playing this card. But now transitioning back into good burn cards, we have Tremendous Fire. Tremendous Fire is a burn spell that reads, inflict 1,000 points of damage to your opponent's life points and 500 points of damage to your life points. This easily outclasses all the burn spells from Yugi-Kaiba format, the maximum of which there was Okazi, which only dealt 800. Now, of course, Tremendous Fire does come with a minor downside, where you have to pay 500 life points. But honestly, that's not really much of a downside, because if you're activating these Tremendous Fires, you're trying to kill your opponent. You're not really caring about your own life points. Tremendous Fire's introduction to the format also means that you can technically kill your opponent using only burn spells. 3 Tremendous Fire is 3,000. 3 Okazi brings it to 5,400. 3 Final Flame brings it to 7,200. And then only 2 Hinotama remain, and you've got 8,200. If you add on the additional Hinotama and 3 Sparks, that brings it up to 9,300 total. Which, you know, if they're playing Diane Ketos, I guess, they can get up to that amount. But it's still kind of cool that you can kill them in such a way, just only burn. And maybe that's a potential deck that you want to pursue. You can make a stall burn deck where you wall up with monsters and you just try and kill your opponent through only burn spells, which would be pretty interesting. Just Desserts is also still a great burn card to consider in this format. Especially given if your opponent activates Heavy Storm, you can chain Just Desserts to Heavy Storm and still get its effect off. Maybe it won't be at the ideal time, but it's still a bit of chip damage. So Burn can win games on its own now, and it's become a lot better of a strategy. However, it does often get paired with aggro, because aggro also receives some incredibly strong tools, and they're really a match made in heaven. When I covered Yugi-Kaiba format, I didn't really cover an aggro burn strategy because I thought it was just too similar to a standard aggro strategy, and I stand by that. But this format, aggro burn, is very much its own unique thing, and so I will be covering that on the channel because it is a pretty good deck. But moving away from the aggro and burny side of things, we get to what is probably the most popular and potentially best strategy in this format, which is Control. Before diving in to the tools that Control received, I think we should just talk about what Control is. So Control is a style of deck that is basically trying to control what your opponent does, what cards they're able to activate, what cards they have access to, and also, you know, being able to respond to whatever your opponent does. Now, there were sort of like pseudo-control strategies in Yugi-Kaiba format, like I'd say Soul Control, while being called Control, and being able to remove certain monsters that your opponent had, is more of like an aggro deck with another form of removal. I think the closest we got to like a pure control strategy was like back row control, and that wasn't quite good. I've heard of a new sort of deck in Yugi-Kaiba format that's combining both soul control and back row control, so that might be able to be called an actual real control deck. But most of the decks in Yugi-Kaiba format were just some flavor of aggro. Here, though, in Metal Raiders, we actually got the tools to make full-on control decks in a way completely different from Yugi-Kaiba format. You may notice that the first 6 cards that I've got on this list here are actually 6 of the cards that I talked about at length in the new core cards section of this video, discussing how they basically warped the meta around them. And they're all really good control tools. Sangan and Witch enable you to get whatever monster you need for a specific scenario right to hand. Masked Sorcerer and White Magical Hat enable you to both draw more cards, and thus have more options to deal with what your opponent's doing, and also deplete your opponent of resources and deprive them of what they're able to do. And Magician of Faith and Mask of Darkness turns the graveyard into its own sort of toolbox, where you can get back what spell or trap you need for a given scenario. So all these cards, very, very good for all manner of control strategies. But they're not the only good tools for control that were released in the format. So let's talk a bit more about those. The first sort of control tool I want to talk about is Thunder Dragon. Now, Thunder Dragon at first may not seem like it's a tool for control or even a good card in general. It's a level 5 monster with 1600 attack that reads you can discard this card, add up to 2 Thunder Dragon from your deck to your hand. So why would you play this? You know, if you're playing a tribute monster, why not play like Summon Skull? Sure, it gets 2 more copies of itself from the deck, but like, is that really worth it if the monster's so weak? Well, while it may seem weak at first, keeping in mind that card advantage is so important, like, it becomes a lot more powerful. Firstly, playing this card essentially means that you're playing a 38 card deck. You're not likely to draw 2 of this in your opening hand. If you do, that's kind of unfortunate. But if you just draw 1 at some point in the game and discard it off to get the other 2 to hand, you've basically reduced the size of your deck by 2 cards, which is pretty good when you're a control deck that is looking for options to deal with your opponent's stuff. Also, having additional cards in hand can be very good for things like Muka Muka, which relies on your hand size for its attack strength. It can also be good for paying costs of things like Magic Jammer, and also Tribute to the Doomed, which I'll cover later. Just cards that require you to discard a card, you can just discard the Thunder Dragon in your hand, because its main purpose was to thin down your deck. It can also be really good in a sort of soul control strategy, making sure that your soul exchanges are actually online. So Thunder Dragon has a bunch of different applications in this sort of deck. Honestly, I think that it could be played in more decks besides control, and I'm not just talking about the Jank Fusion deck that would use it. Just being able to thin your deck down a bit is super powerful. So I almost included this card in my core cards section of the video. I am, however, including it here because I do think that, you know, control does take advantage of its benefits a lot better than most other decks in the format. And in something like Beatdown or like Aggro, where you're really trying to get as much damage on board as possible and as quickly as possible, Thunder Dragon can be a bit of a brick in those decks, even though it does make the deck more consistent by thinning it down. Now, I covered Muka Muka in the Beatdown section of the video, but realistically, it's more of a control tool, you know? You want to play in a deck that can benefit off of things like Mass Sorcerer, drawing you more cards, Thunder Dragon bolstering your hand up a little bit. So, Muka Muka can be the control deck's sort of like beefiest monster that it brings out later in the game, after it's assembled a bunch of cards in hand, a big advantage on the opponent. There are also 2 other monsters that sort of fall into their own unique sort of control deck, which are Crass Clown and Dream Clown. They form the basis of a deck called Clown Control, which is based on changing their battle positions to activate their powerful effects. Crass Clown, its effect reads, when this card is changed from defense position to attack position, return 1 monster on your opponent's side of the field to the owner's hand. So like if you had set this face down and then flipped it face up, you can bounce back an opponent's monster to hand, attack in for 1350. That can be pretty good. Dream Clown reads, when this card is changed from attack position to defense position, destroy 1 monster on your opponent's side of the field. This can also be incredibly good if you're able to bring this out, protect it for a turn, maybe with something like Waboku, switch it to defense, pop an opponent's monster. That can just be a very powerful way to clear their board. However, I think that these cards require a bit too much setup to actually be a good sort of engine for a control deck. They definitely saw some historical play and will definitely get better as more cards are introduced in later sets. But I'm kind of doubtful of how good they can be in this format. I am planning on playing with the deck though, making my own spin on it, so we'll see how that is able to do. And it can be fun when you actually do pull off the clown combo. But those are the major control monsters here, and there are a lot of really good ones here. But the traps are also incredibly good for control. I already talked about Solemn Judgment in the core card section of this video. This deck, I think, is the best counter trap card that is out there. Just being able to stop your opponent's really key plays that you don't want them to get through is really important, even if you have to lose half your life points to do it. Oftentimes, a control deck cares less about its life points and more about, you know, stopping your opponent from doing something that could be majorly impactful. The cost does have a bit of a risk, though, because burn decks do exist, as I mentioned, and paying Solemn Judgment's life point cost can bring you down low enough where they can just kill you out of nowhere. So you might also want to stock up on some other counter traps in the set that have less steep costs. Magic Jammer is a counter trap that negates spell card activations, and all it costs is for you to discard one card, which for a control deck might not be that big of a cost to pay, especially if you've got something like Thunder Dragon in hand. So Magic Jammer can be pretty decent. 7 Tools of the Bandit can negate trap effects, which also has the added benefit of being able to negate other counter traps, which is pretty cool, especially in the control match mirror. However, I think it does have sort of limited utility compared to Magic Jammer and Solemn Judgment, although its 1,000 life point cost is a lot more agreeable than Solemn Judgment's is. And also, lastly, the black sheep of the counter trap family here, we have Horn of Heaven. And Horn of Heaven reads, when a monster would be summoned, tribute one monster, negate the summon, and if you do, destroy that monster. Now, this is a fairly steep cost to pay for preventing your opponent's summon, but that cost can be mitigated a bit if you're tributing something like a Sangan or a Witch, so it's not terrible. Also, negating the summon of an opponent's Sangan or Witch doesn't actually trigger the Sangan or Witch effect, because when you negate a summon, the monster doesn't actually get counted as being sent from field to graveyard, because its summon was negated, so it never actually made it to the field. So negating the summon of an opponent's Sangan or Witch can be pretty powerful, just preventing them from getting that powerful search that they would get if the monster was destroyed by other ways. Moving on from the counter traps, we also have a new continuous trap, Robin Goblin. And Robin Goblin reads, each time a monster you control inflicts battle damage to your opponent discards one random card, which is pretty crazy. It basically turns every monster into a white magical hat, and if you've got a bunch of monsters attacking in one turn, this can just decimate your opponent's hand. Now, of course, it does have some weaknesses, like being a continuous trap, it can die to Heavy Storm pretty easily. There are sort of ways to mitigate this if you use like Solemn Judgment or Magic Jammer on that Heavy Storm, or use one of the cards that I'm going to feature in the next section of this video. But it can be a bit of a liability. That being said, even if you only manage to discard one card with this, that's still pretty good. Robin Goblin also opens the door to a bit more jank hand control strategies. There are a series of monsters in this set that can just attack directly. Mystic Lamp, Legul, Jinzo number 7, Oguchi, Rainbow Flower, and Queen's Double all have very, very low attack values, but they all can just attack directly. So if you have Robin Goblin up, even if your opponent has defenders on the field, if you have a bunch of these attackers out, you can just attack and decimate your opponent's hand. Is that very good? Well, not necessarily, because these monsters are generally just so weak and you're not likely to have more than one on the field at a time. But it is a direction that you can go with Robin Goblin, even if I don't think it's a very good direction. But we've discussed sort of all the different directions that you can sort of go strategy-wise. I guess we haven't talked about stall yet, but stall didn't really receive any super impactful stall tools, so I'm not going to really discuss it as its own section here. I will discuss the individual stall strategies that you can actually use later on, and stall is not terrible in this format, so I do think it's something to watch out for, but I'm not really going to give it its own section like this. But before we move on to discussing other sort of more jank strategies that Metal Raider introduced, there are a couple cards that this set introduced that, you know, don't really quite fit in to any one strategy in particular, and also aren't quite good enough to be meta threats, but I think they are interesting to talk about, and they can be decent. So let's go over them now. There are a bunch of cards in this format that, you know, could be played in a lot of different decks, but, you know, aren't quite good enough to be core cards. But I think these cards do have potential to be played if you want to play them. First, for the monsters, we have Time Wizard. Time Wizard reads, once per turn, you can toss a coin and call it. If you call it right, destroy all monsters your opponent controls. If you call it wrong, destroy as many monsters you control as possible, and if you do, take damage equal to half the total attack those destroys monsters had while face up on the field. If you call the coin toss right, this can be incredibly good. you could just wipe out your opponent's whole board of monsters, which is insane. However, if you call it wrong, it can wipe out your own board of monsters, which is a bit rough. Sure, things like Last Will can mitigate this cost. You Time Wizard, get it incorrect. You've got the Last Will to bring out a defender as backup potentially. But, it's still a really rough cost, especially if you have a bunch of monsters on field. Also, I think there's just generally better removal in this set than Time Wizard. So I don't actually think it's that good of a card. But I do think that if you're willing to test your luck a bit and go a bit jank, this card can potentially be decent. Moving on to another very unique card, we have Kuriboh. Now, Kuriboh is a monster that is widely seen as the first quote-unquote hand trap, which means a monster that you can basically activate its effect from the hand in a way that can surprise your opponent and potentially swing the game in your favor. So, Kuriboh reads, during damage calculation, if your opponent's monster attacks, quick effect, you can discard this card. You take no battle damage from that battle. So, this can be good protection against more aggro decks. If your opponent's attacking him with a Jirai Gumo, you discard the Kuriboh, save yourself 2,200 points of damage. However, I think Waboku is just better because Waboku is able to stop all battle damage coming in on a given turn. Sure, Waboku is susceptible to Heavy Storm, but at least you can chain Waboku to the Heavy Storm. So you still get the battle protection and life point protection for that turn, even if it's not the ideal turn to activate Waboku. But I guess if you really are worried about being Heavy Stormed, or just you want to have some additional form of protection that you can search off of a Sangan or a Witch, Kuriboh could be a good option. Moving on to another level 1 monster that can help protect you from big offensive pushes, we have the Unhappy Maiden. The Unhappy Maiden is a monster that, when sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, ends the battle phase immediately. So this can be good if your opponent's got a lot of offensive threats on board. You set the Unhappy Maiden, they attack over it, and, battle phase ends, so they're not able to attack anymore. So this could be a decent option in some stall decks or just some control decks that are worried about taking a bunch of damage. However, like I said for Kuriboh, I think Waboku is generally better. And if your opponent manages to get rid of this without attacking over it, then it doesn't actually protect you, which can be kind of unfortunate. So all in all, I don't think this card's the best, although it's definitely not a bad option to include in a deck. And lastly, for the monsters, we have Big Eye. So Big Eye, it's a flip effect monster with decent stats for a flip effect monster. 1,200 attack, 1,000 defense, so not bad. And its flip effect says, look at up to 5 cards from the top of your deck, then place them on top of the deck in any order. It does say up to 5, but why not just look at all 5? I think that clause is in place in case your deck actually has less than 5 cards. But at that point, the Big Eye effect won't really be that useful because you're at real risk of decking out. But Big Eye, it can be somewhat decent to stack your deck in order that you actually care about. Getting a potentially good card out of your deck, and then potentially shuffling away the bad ones through a Sangan and Witch Church is not terrible. In Exodia decks as well, I guess this can draw you deeper to Exodia if you need it. There are just a couple different applications for this that can make it a decent card to play, I think. However, it doesn't really do anything on its own, and for that reason, I think that it's just not that good. There are enough good cards in this format that there aren't really going to be many duds in your deck to draw. Maybe Thunder Dragon of the really good cards in your deck. But I think in general, you don't really need its effect to play a good game if you're playing well. But if you do want to sort of have this additional layer of control over what you're actually getting from your draws, then Big Eye is a good option to consider. The spells are where things get really interesting in my opinion. So firstly, we have Block Attack. Block Attack, much like Stop Defense, switches the battle position of an opponent's monster. However, unlike Stop Defense, this is a lot more useful against your opponent's offensive threats, because it switches an attack position monster to defense position. Most of the offensive threats in this format don't actually have that high of a defense, which means that oftentimes if you use Block Attack on a monster, you'll be able to attack over it with one of your monsters. That being said, this isn't a perfect form of removal. If your opponent has something like Waboku, then they'll be able to protect their monster, switch it back to attack on their turn, and attack in. But oftentimes this can be good enough. So, not a terrible inclusion in your deck. Tribute to the Doom is probably the best targeted monster removal in this set. Very simple but very powerful effect. Discard one card, then target one monster in the field and destroy it. Now, this is technically a 2-for-1. You use 2 cards up to get rid of one of your opponents, so that can be kind of unfortunate. But if you're playing a control deck where you draw a lot of cards, or if you've got Thunder Dragons in hand to discard for this, then the cost can be mitigated somewhat. And even if you can't mitigate the cost, sometimes you just really value the removal and are willing to pay that cost. So I think Tribute to the Doomed is definitely a card to consider playing if your deck really lacks a lot of removal. Next up, continuing the removal train, we've got Share the Pain. Share the Pain is a very interesting card. It says tribute one monster and make your opponent tribute one monster for no effect. So what this means is that if you have a monster on your field and your opponent has a monster on their field, then you can activate Share the Pain, tribute your monster off, and they're forced to tribute their monster as well. Now, there are some downsides to this. If your opponent has multiple monsters on their field, then they get to pick what monster they tribute. So, you know, they can just tribute off like a Sangan, get some value off that potentially. But I think this card is still very neat. And also can combo really well things like Soul Exchange, because you can basically tribute 2 of their monsters away with Soul Exchange. So that's a pretty cool application of this. However, I think its cost is just a bit too steep over things like Tribute to the Doomed. And also, you know, the fact that it's not really targeted, that they get to choose what monster to tribute, makes it a lot worse than something like Tribute to the Doomed, which they can't control what you're destroying. So I don't think this card is the best. However, I do think it can be great in Soul Exchange decks, and it does have applications outside of that as well if you want some unique form of removal in your deck. Moving on, we've got Shield and Sword, which says switch the original attack and defense of all face-up monsters currently on the field until the end of this turn. This can function as sort of a block attack, in which you're taking advantage of the weak defense of your opponent's major aggressive threats and bring out a monster to attack over it. This can also be used to sort of fuel a major damage push if you're playing a more defensive deck. Let's say you have a bunch of 2k defenders on field, activate Shield and Sword, you've got a bunch of 2k attackers on field now, which can be a really powerful aggressive push. So I think this is a really interesting card with a bunch of really cool applications. However, you know, like I said, for block attack, it can suffer from your opponent having Waboku, which makes it potentially not the best form of removal or offensive push tool at your disposal, but it's there, and it's very fun. We also have some interesting equip spells that actually apply a negative condition to a monster, and I'm pretty sure this is the first instance of equip spells doing this that we've seen so far. So Paralyzing Potion says a non-machine type monster equipped with this card cannot attack. This can be used as a bit of a stalling tool to, you know, prevent your opponent's aggressive threats from really making offensive pushes. Opponent's got a Jiraigumo on the field, you equip it with a Paralyzing Potion. That Jiraigumo is not attacking you anytime soon. Unfortunately, that Jiraigumo is not going anywhere anytime soon unless you have some other way to get rid of it, but this can be a good stalling tactic. Unfortunately, things like Heavy Storm do exist, which means that Paralyzing Potion's effectiveness is a lot worse than an actual permanent form of removal, but it's still not terrible. The other equip spell that we have here is Germ Infection, which says the attack of a non-machine type monster equipped with this card is decreased by 300 points at the end of its standby phases. This is kind of a weird card. It says at the end of its standby phases, which is just meant to be like the controller of that monster's standby phases. But this card kind of just takes too long to remove. Sure, you know, eventually you'll be able to whittle down like a Jiraigumo or a Lajin to a point where a weaker monster can get over it. But the fact that it first takes effect during your opponent's turn really weakens its effectiveness if you want immediate removal. And again, Heavy Storm does exist, so that automatically weakens the effectiveness of this card just like it did for Paralyzing Potion. But you could feasibly use these cards as a form of very slow stalling or removal. And lastly, we have the trap card Fake Trap. Fake Trap is the other sort of counter that I've been mentioning to Heavy Storm, where it says activate only when your opponent activates a spell, trap, or effect monster's effect that would destroy a trap card you control. Destroy this card instead. If the cards that would have been destroyed are face down, you can look at them to confirm. Now, this is a very neat card that can actually have some benefits over using like a Solemn Judgment to counter Heavy Storm. For one, it doesn't protect your opponent's cards, so if your opponent activates Heavy Storm and they've got some back row, Fake Trap will actually force your opponent to destroy that back row, and Fake Trap will protect your traps that you want to protect. It also doesn't really have a steep cost associated with it. You know, the worst thing that could happen potentially is flipping up your traps to reveal them to your opponent, but honestly, that's not too bad. However, while it does have its benefits, it also has its downsides. For one, it doesn't actually protect your spell cards that you have set, so if you were setting a spell to play around something like a White Magical Hat or a card destruction, then the Heavy Storm will still destroy that spell, unfortunately. In addition, revealing traps to your opponent can enable your opponent to play around them more easily, so that can reduce the effectiveness of the traps that you're protecting. However, I do think this is not a bad card to use in certain decks, especially decks that are relying on more continuous traps like Robin Goblin or even Ultimate Offering. I think that Ultimate Offering can still have its uses in this format, even though Heavy Storm is around. And I think if you're going to play an Ultimate Offering deck, you definitely want to play some Fake Traps in there. That being said, I definitely don't think that this is the card for every deck. I think that, if your deck cares a lot about keeping your traps on the field, and you either don't have access to many counter traps, or you can't afford to pay the cost that those counter traps incur, then Fake Trap could be good. But in general, I don't think it's a card that fits in every deck. Now, I know I might have been stretching the definition of decent here with a couple of the cards that I showed off, but trust me, we haven't even begun to dive in to the absolute jank that is some of the cards in this set. To get us closer to that point, let's dive in to some of the janker strategies that have been introduced by this set as well. If you thought there were a lot of jank strategies in Yugi-Kaiba format, then hoo boy, you're in for a wild ride, because Metal Raiders introduced a lot of new directions you can take your jank, and a lot of it is actually a lot worse than it was in Yugi-Kaiba format. Of course, this isn't helped by the fact that in Critter format, I think decks just generally grow in power level a bit, so these weaker strategies are thus even weaker. But, even if they're weak, people are always going to try and pull off these crazy win cons and crazy strategies. So, let's talk about them. The first sort of jank we have is Tribal. Now, if you don't know, Tribal just refers to strategies that try and buff monsters of a specific type or attribute. Last format, that manifested in things like equip strategies or field spell strategies that gave very marginal boosts in attack or defense, but those marginal boosts were enough to be worth playing. This format introduces some monsters that can buff specific attributes and give them a fair amount of attack, but that actually I think are less worth playing than equips and field spells were last format. And I'll get into why. But first, let's talk about the cards themselves. So all the monsters in this sort of series of Tribal monsters buff a monster of their given attribute by 500 attack and debuff a monster of their quote-unquote opposite attribute by 400 attack. So we have Shining In for Light, which is Apprentice for Dark, Starboy for Water, Little Chimera for Fire, Malice Radiant for Earth, and Bladefly for Wind. And these quote-unquote opposite attribute pairs are Light and Dark, Water, Fire, and Earth and Wind. Now, this buff is non-negligible, and it does open the door to try out tribal strategies that were previously unviable just because they didn't have any support for them. But I think in general, these cards are not actually that good. There are many reasons for this, but the most important one is that oftentimes it takes 2 normal summons to set up the combo, and a lot of these decks just can't afford wasting 2 normal summons on that. For instance, if you're trying to use Witch's Apprentice to buff up a Login over something like a Jirai-Gumo, then you have to normal summon the Login, and then normal summon the Witch's Apprentice on another turn. There are some ways around this, like, if you manage to pull off a Last Will, you can bring out one of these monsters, special summoning it. But that's kind of hard to pull off in a lot of cases. Outside of very specific scenarios where these things actually do work out well, it takes 2 normal summons, and in this time, the monster that you're trying to buff, like let's say the Login versus the Jirai-Gumo, has probably already been destroyed by your opponent's monster that you're trying to get over. So, I think that these cards are not actually good for the tribal strategies that they're a part of, and that's why they're here in Jank. Next up, we have Fusion, and Fusion actually received a bunch of different new directions it can go because it received a bunch of new Fusion monsters. Now, last format, my standard for talking about whether a Fusion monster was worth playing or not was whether it had over 1800 attack or not. Because if it had less than 1800 attack, it wasn't worth playing because Logins already had 1800 attack. So the standard for this format is going to be if it has 2200 or more attack, because Jirai-Gumo does exist. So Jirai-Gumo does come with a cost to it, but the fact that it's a 1-card monster to bring out as opposed to a potentially 3-card combo, I'm calling that the standard. But there are a fair amount of Fusion monsters in this set that actually do meet that standard and surpass it, and actually has some interesting pros and cons outside of that. Black Skull Dragon is the Fusion monster with the highest attack in the format, 3200. That enables it to even get over a Blue Eyes White Dragon, which was the highest attack point monster in the format before this. And its fusion materials actually aren't too bad. Red Eyes Black Dragon, not a very good card, but Summon Skull actually does see some play. It's still the 1 tribute monster with the highest attack in the set. So this honestly isn't bad. Sure, you're playing some Red Eyes, which can brick, but Summon Skull is less of a brick and also can be searched off of something like Witch of the Black Forest. So Black Skull Dragon, not a bad option to go into. However, I think the better option here is actually Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon. Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon is interesting. It's a fusion monster made with just 2 Thunder Dragons. And if you'll remember back to when I discussed Thunder Dragon in the control section of this video, this makes it a lot more easy to bring out than most other fusion monsters. Thunder Dragon has an effect that you discard 1 Thunder Dragon and you get 2 to hand, which means that instead of being the typical 3-card combo that most fusion decks rely on, it is basically a 2-card combo. All you need is 1 Thunder Dragon, 1 Polymerization. Thunder Dragon can also be searched with Witch of the Black Forest, which means that, you can get an easy fusion summon online when you need it to be. And Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon's 2800 attack is also incredibly good. Sure, it doesn't beat a Black Skull Dragon, but it beats pretty much everything else in the format that you're likely to see. So I think Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon is the best sort of fusion strategy if you want to go that direction. But the other monsters that beat the 2200 threshold are not that bad either. Thousand Dragon has 2400 attack, and it's actually made with Time Wizard, which is a card that I mentioned as being potentially decent, If you're already playing Time Wizard in the deck, then you could potentially play Polymerization and a Baby Dragon as well, especially because all of Thousand Dragon's fusion materials can be searched with Sangan and Witch, which potentially makes the combo a bit easier to pull off. Bakuri Box has less attack with 2300, but its fusion materials Crash Clown and Dream Clown make up the Clown Control deck that I mentioned in the control section of the video, which means that if you're already playing Clown Control, you might want to play some Polymerizations as well just to bring out a 2300 attacker if you so wish. I don't think it's the best way to play Clown Control, but you can just go all in on this if you want to go as jank as possible with the strategy. And of course, Crash Clown and Dream Clown can also both be searched by Witch and Sangan, so that's also incredibly good. And lastly, we have Labyrinth Tank, which is another 2400 attack point monster that also has 2400 defense, which is pretty respectable. And it's made with Cannon Soldier and Gigateth Wolf. As I mentioned before, Cannon Soldier is a great card that can see play in a variety of different decks. So if you're already playing Cannon Soldier in a deck, then you could potentially include some Gigatech Wolves and some polymerizations. Gigatech Wolf, just like a lot of the other fusion materials I mentioned, can be searched with both Sandgate and Witch, which means that, you could potentially pull this combo off a bit more consistently than you could in the last format. So Fusion, I think, gets big boost this format with both searchers to search out fusion materials and also just better fusion monsters to go into. However, it does have some major flaws that come about from the new forms of interaction in this format. If your opponent has like a Solemn Judgment or a Magic Jammer, they can in fact negate polymerization, which can be really, really rough for you if you spent all this time getting the pieces together to actually go into a fusion monster and the summon of it gets negated. So it both got better and worse, but I will be covering this deck on my channel in the future at some point. So we'll see how better or worse it got. The next Jank strategy is Harpy Ladies. Now, Harpy Lady is just a normal monster with 1300 attack and 1400 defense, so it's not really much to call home about. But it does combo with Elegant Egotist, which is a spell card that lets you bring out either a Harpy Lady from the deck or a Harpy Lady Sisters, which is a monster with 1950 attack that unfortunately can't be normal summoned or set, and must first be special summoned with Elegant Egotist. But 1950 is pretty decent. That gets over a Login, so there could be something here. And just being able to swarm the field with more Harpy Ladies too could be decent enough as well. Being able to bring out Harpy Lady also off of Last Will can turn this combo online potentially more often. So, this could potentially be a decent strategy to go here. Unfortunately, Harpy Lady Sisters having less attack than both Dark Elf and Jirai Gumo can make the strategy less good than some other aggro strategies. But I think it's definitely a fun Jank strategy to experiment with, and I will be trying this out on the channel as well. Perfect for the spooky season of October, we've got Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts, and Castle of Dark Illusions. These two monsters sort of combine to form sort of a zombie tribal strategy, which is pretty interesting. Castle of Dark Illusions is a flip monster with a respectable amount of defense that has a super interesting effect that buffs all zombie monsters on the field when it's flipped up, and then during each of your next 4 standby phases, it increases that buff, and that buff lasts as long as this card is face up on the field. It does have some major flaws, though. It doesn't buff monsters that you bring out after it's flipped up, so you need to have a fair amount of monsters on the field already to reap the full benefits of this card. But, it's not bad. It also doesn't benefit from the buffs itself, which is kind of unfortunate. So you really do need an additional monster to combo with it. And a card that combos with it pretty well is Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts. Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts says, while Castle of Dark Illusions is face up on the field, this card gains 100 attack and defense, and it gains an additional 100 attack and defense during each of your next 4 standby phases. So this can buff it up to a 2300 attack monster on a level 6, which is not bad, and if you have flipped up Castle of Dark Illusions in conjunction with this, that can buff it up to an additional 3300 attack after 5 turns, basically. However, this is a bit too slow to actually be pretty good in my opinion, and it requires just too much to go right with being able to flip up Castle of Dark Illusions while you actually have Pumpkin on the field or another respectable zombie monster. So I think this deck is pretty bad, but it is kind of neat. I might show it off on the channel at some point. I just think it's really, really bad, but it's very funny and unique. Continuing the train of really bad strategies, we have Gate Guardian. Now, Gate Guardian is the monster in the set that actually has the highest attack with 3750, but it can't be normal summoned or set, and it has to be special summoned by tributing 1 Song of the Thunder, Kazejin, and Suijin from your field. Now, without knowing what Song of the Thunder, Kazejin, and Suijin are, you might think, oh, well, that's not that bad, and 3750 might be worth, trying to set that up. Well, here's the problem. Song of the Thunder, Suijin, and Kazejin are all level 7 monsters, which means that they can't be brought out without using 2 tributes. And using 2 tributes to bring out each of these monsters is just a lot of investment. And you've got to trust that your opponent won't use like a board clear to just get rid of them while you're setting up for the Gate Guardian. So it's like, it's just really tough to actually pull off the combo. I will say that Kajin, Suijin, and Song of the Thunder are not bad for 2 tribute monsters. Like, they've got an effect that can basically make an attacking monster, drop down to 0 attack to protect themselves from battle, which is not bad, and they've got pretty good attack stats. But, I don't really think they're worth running because 2 tribute monsters are just such an investment, especially given the high amount of removal in the set. And Gate Guardian itself is definitely not worth running. Like, you're never going to pull off this combo. It's definitely a pipe dream at best. And it's a strategy that's out there, but you'll never actually manage to pull it off. And lastly, for the terrible strategies, we have Great Moth. Maybe this isn't as bad as Gate Guardian, but I'm putting it here because it just needs so much to go right, and in this format in particular, so much can go wrong. So basically, Great Moth's goal is to bring out Great Moth, and in order to do this, it must first bring out Petite Moth, which is a very weak normal monster, and equip it with Cocoon of Evolution. Now, Cocoon of Evolution is a very interesting monster. It lets you target a Petite Moth you control and equip it from your hand to that Petite Moth. So this is kind of interesting because it's a monster card that's acting as a spell card. It's also a 2k defender if you need it to be, which is not terrible. And it also turns Petite Moth into a 2k defender. However, it's kind of tough to actually make it so that the Petite Moth will survive another turn, because if you've got the Petite Moth face up, that probably means you just summoned it out in attack position. And Cocoon of Evolution has 0 attack, which means that this is not the best. Waboku can protect it, I guess. If you've got Mirror Force, that can protect it. But you've got to protect it for that initial turn, which is already tough enough. And then, in order to actually bring out Great Moth, you have to wait 4 turns. And if this combo has managed to survive for 4 turns, then you can bring out Great Moth from your hand. But since Cocoon of Evolution is acting as a spell card, it can be Heavy Stormed, Like, Heavy Storm is a card that you have to play around in this format. And if your opponent's got Heavy Storm for this, you could just lose all your progress on this combo. In addition, Great Moth is unsearchable. So there's no way to actually ensure that you have Great Moth in your hand on the 4th turn that you've managed to set this combo up. And Great Moth doesn't say that you can bring it out on the over 4th turn after your Petite Moth has been equipped with Cocoon of Evolution. It just says on the 4th of your turns. So if you draw this on the 5th of your turns, you can't bring it out, I'm pretty sure. Which means that despite being a beefy monster, there are just too many hoops to jump through to actually pull off this combo reliably. Which makes it pretty bad. I will also say there's another monster that goes with this strategy called Larva Moth, which is arguably the worst card I have ever read. Which, just like Great Moth, it can't be normal summoned or set, and it can only be special summoned by tributing Petite Moth on the 2nd of your turns after Petite Moth has been equipped with Cocoon of Evolution. And it's got 500 attack and 400 defense. Why would you bring this out? Why would you care? I guess it can trigger Last Will. So if you're looking for a Last Will trigger, you can, tribute off Petite Moth for Larva Moth, but it's just not good. There's no reason why you should go into this. It exists solely because in the anime, this was one of the stages of Great Moth's evolution. And it is kind of interesting because, it's got 200 more attack and 200 more defense than Petite Moth, and it's brought out after 2 turns. So the Cocoon, I guess, is adding 100 attack and defense to the Petite Moth every turn until the 4th turn when it just exponentially increases and brings it up to 2,600. But, this strategy is just very, very, very bad. You know, very much a pipe dream. Uh, I think it's easier to pull off than Gate Guardian potentially, but it's just still abjectly terrible. And that's sort of like the extent of the jank in this set. You know, the new jank at least. There are still some of the old janker strategies that I'll discuss later when I'm discussing how the Yugi-Kaiba sort of decks fare in this format. But these are the new sort of avenues you can take, the new tools for those avenues. And I think it's actually pretty interesting. While a lot of these are a lot more unplayable than the jank in Yugi-Kaiba, I think they're more fun conceptually than the jank in Yugi-Kaiba. So it'll be interesting to experiment with some of the more playable jank in this format and just like try and pull off these crazy win conditions. That being said, while all of these cards contribute to their own sort of fun, cohesive-ish strategies, this set also introduced some cards that just kind of make you go, huh, like why was this ever printed? Why did they think that this would actually be a good card? So let's dive into those, because I think those are some of the most interesting cards that this set has to offer. Listen, I know this first card that I'm showing off for this category of cards is going to be controversial, because Barrel Dragon is a card that has a lot of nostalgia for people, and also it seems pretty decent, right? 2600 attack, has an effect that can destroy your opponent's monsters. Not bad, right? Well, here's the thing. It's 2 tributes. Like, that's a really big cost to pay in this format. And also, its destruction effect doesn't guarantee destroy the monster. Which is like, you know, if you're gonna put this on a 2 tribute monster, just have it automatically destroy the monster. Like, you don't need this, like, potential not destroying of a monster. So, like, I don't know. It's a very disappointing card. And I think if you're doing a 2 tribute monster, this is actually one of the less good ones to go into. I mean, I don't think this is a terrible 2 tribute monster to play if you're playing 2 tribute monsters. But, like, it's just too much investment for not enough payoff. But I think you can definitely play this in some decks if you so choose. I mainly put it here because I didn't really have another good place to put it. The rest of the cards in this section, though, these are just pretty bad. Firstly, we've got Steel Scorpion. It's a pretty weak monster, 250 attack, 300 defense. It says a non-machine type monster attacking Steel Scorpion will be destroyed at the end phase of your opponent's second turn after the attack. In addition to being kind of confusing on when exactly that monster dies, it's just way too slow. It's way too slow for removal. If this is your best removal option for a monster, then you're going to be suffering a lot more from that monster, because that monster can still attack in to hit you. That monster can still prevent you from attacking. Like, this card just takes way too much setup, and you don't even have a guarantee on which monster is going to attack it. Maybe the monster that you want to kill is not the one actually attacking. Maybe your opponent brings out a Sangan and attacks your face down, and it's Steel Scorpion. They're like, okay, that's fine. I don't care if my Sangan dies in 2 turns. It's just not a very good card. There's just so much better removal that acts instantly, so why not use that? By a similar but less bad token, we have Electric Lizard. Electric Lizard says, a non-zombie type monster attacking Electric Lizard cannot attack on its following turn. This is both slightly better and slightly worse than Steel Scorpion. Its effect is more immediate, as they won't be able to attack on the next turn as opposed to like 2 turns from now. So, not terrible in that regard as a stall option, but it also doesn't actually deal with the threat of that monster. So, is it really worth playing? I mean, I'd prefer a more solid removal option, like Man-Eater Bug would be better than either of these cards. I also want to mention that this, like, type sort of thing, like non-machine, non-zombie, I mean, that's basically every monster that's played in this set. There are very few good machines and zombies at this point in the game. I guess there is a jank idea where you can make a machine deck or a zombie deck to play specifically around Electric Lizard, Steel Scorpion, Paralyzing Potion, and Germ Infection, I guess. But I don't see why you would do that when those cards are all kind of not very good. And you could probably just win against decks playing them by playing a good deck. Moving on to another pretty baffling card, we have Blast Juggler. Blast Juggler says you can only activate this effect during your standby phase. Offer this face-up card its tribute to select and destroy 2 face-up monsters with an attack 1,000 or less. When are you going to do this? Like, I guess if you summon it out to bait your opponent into attacking with a Masked Sorcerer, and you have, like, Waboku, and then, you know, next turn you tribute it to destroy their Masked Sorcerer, I guess. It's not terrible, but that seems like the most roundabout way to destroy a pretty weak monster that I've ever seen. I guess this can also be used to destroy opponents' like defense position monsters. So if they've got like a mystical elf in defense position, you can bring out Blast Juggler, trust that they're not going to actually have a way to deal with it in the turn that you give them to deal with it, tribute it off to destroy the mystical elf, I guess. I mean, it seems kind of bad to me, but I guess you could use it for that sort of removal, but I don't know. This card's just bafflingly bad. Like, why play this? Why print this? I guess it's a machine, so it dodges around Steel Scorpion, so there's that, I guess, but not a very good card. Moving on to an iconic pair of cards, we've got Lava Battle Guard and Swamp Battle Guard. These had a pretty iconic anime moment from Duelist Kingdom, but in the actual context of the card game, they're pretty bad. So they're both level 5 monsters, which means you need to tribute to bring them out. They both have over 1500 attack, which means you can't cheat them out with Last Will or anything. But they both have the effect that they gain 500 attack for each of the other type you control. So if you've got a Swamp Battle Guard up with 2 Lava Battle Guard, then it goes up 2800 attack. And if you have a Lava Battle Guard up with 2 Swamp Battle Guards, goes up to 2550 attack, which are both decent attack stats. The issue is the amount of investment to get that sort of board online is just way too much for like the little benefit that you get. While you're setting up that board, you basically got a monster with 1800 attack and a monster with 1800 defense because you're probably not bringing out Lava Battle Guard and attack when you first summon it. And that's just not good enough in this format. So I think these cards are too bad. Also, they can't... I mean, Swamp Battle Guard can be searched with Witch, but, like, Lava Battle Guard can't be searched at all, and neither can be searched with Sangan, so it's, like, not a very consistent sort of strategy. Moving on, we've got the Immortal of Thunder, which is an interesting flip effect monster that I could see potential niche uses for, but in general, it's pretty bad. So, flip it up. It increases your life points by 3,000, but when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you lose 5,000 life points. So it's basically going to cost you 2,000 most of the time. There are ways around this, such as, you know, if you have Hain, you can flip up Hain, bounce Immortal Thunder back to hand, and then, you know, just gain 5,000 basically, which is a pretty neat combo that could happen. But it seems like a lot of setup to get that combo online, and you've got to have a lot of things go right for you to actually pull that off. Most of the time, you're probably just going to take the 2,000. Next up, we have Tainted Wisdom. And Tainted Wisdom is a card that, like, you really have to reach for a potential application for its effect at this point in the game's history. So, it's a monster with 1250 attack, 800 defense. It says if this attack position card is changed to face-up defense position, shuffle your deck. Like, I mean, there are very few reasons why you would want to do this. The only one that I could really think of is if you have like a sort of deep-seated on top of your deck and you want to get that back into the deck, not have that be your top card, then I guess that could work. In addition, it can combo, I guess, with Yadokaru, kind of. But, like, I mean, I'll get to Yadokaru later. But I feel like you wouldn't be using Yadokaru to combo with Tainted Wisdom. I guess you can also use it after a Big Eye flip if you see that you don't have any good cards on the top of your deck. You know, switch Tainted Wisdom to defense, hopefully get some better cards on top. But this card's just, I mean, you have to really reach for some very, very niche applications. And honestly, even those niche applications aren't very good. All that being said, there is a fusion monster made with it called Skull Knight, which is 2650 attack, which is pretty good. I didn't mention it in the fusion strategy section of the video because I wanted to mention it here when talking about Tainted Wisdom. But I guess you could just play it in a Skull Knight deck. I'm not sure why you'd be using it for its effect, though. You're probably just using it as a fusion material. The other fusion material for Skull Knight is Ancient Brain, which is just, you know, a weak normal monster. Nothing special about it. But, I mean, I guess this is a strategy that you could do. I just think it's pretty bad. Next up, we have Insect Soldiers of the Sky, which, you know, it's meant to deal with the super meta threat of wind monsters, because the attack of this card increases by 1,000 points whenever it attacks a wind monster. And we all know there are so many good wind monsters in this format. Oh, wait. No, there aren't. There are essentially no wind monsters in this game that are worth playing right now. So this card just, it's kind of weird. Like, what is it here for? I could see it being good if it was like, if it attacked a dark monster. But it's just attacking wind monsters. So, like, why? I just don't get it. I don't get why it's here. I feel like Mindless Radiant is better anti-wind tech than Insect Soldiers of the Sky. But I don't know. This is just a very strange card. Maybe it gets better in later sets, but here it is pretty bad. Speaking of pretty bad, we've also got Yado Karu. Its whole shtick is when it changes from attack to defense position, you can place any number of cards from your hand at the bottom of your deck in any order you desire. Now, as a note, the initial printing of this card, just like, you know, with Lord of D and Mysterious Puppeteer in the last set, actually had a slight difference from this that was quickly corrected. The difference was that, you know, if it's changed from defense to attack position, you can place any number of cards from your hand at the bottom of your deck. Doesn't really change anything. This card is still basically unplayable. It is a strict just minus. You know, you're taking away your resources. Like, why would you do that? I guess you could protect them from, like, things like card destruction. Like, I guess against stall mill decks this can be pretty bad because their card destructions get a lot worse. You're adding more cards to your deck to prevent deck out. So there's that. This could also be used to sort of put back a last will target in the deck so you can bring it out off of last will. I feel like that's a bit more of a reach. I mean, this card's just pretty bad. Like, as I said, could be used as sort of like anti-stall mill tech. But beyond that, I mean, even then, it's kind of bad for anti-stall mill tech. It's just way too slow, and you've got to protect it, and it's just not a very good card. The last monster we have in this section here is Dragon Piper. Finally, Konami gave dragons a tool that they needed to wipe out the meta-defining threat of Dragon Capture Jar. I mean, if you know anything about the last format, you know the Dragon Capture Jar is the bane of every Dragon deck's existence, right? And not just the inconsistency of their combo. I think this card is really bad. Like, if Dragon decks want a card to play that stops Dragon Capture Jar, I feel like Remove Trap is just infinitely better. You don't have to commit to a normal summon on it. You can use it right away. I mean, it's just, this card is not good. Like, I guess it's 1800 defense, so that's not bad as a defender, but like, yeah, it's just, Dragon Capture Jar is not the main problem that Dragon decks have. And even if it was, Remove Trap would be better. So, Dragon Piper is just kind of a useless card that's already power crept on release. Moving on to these spells, we first have Ring of Magnetism. This is an interesting card. You can equip it to a monster on your side of the field. It decreases the attack and defense of the monster by 500, but all the monsters on your opponent's side of the field can only attack that monster. So it's a good way to protect some of your other monsters, I guess. But in general, this will weaken most monsters that you play to a point where your opponent can easily get over them. So it's not the best in that regard. I guess it's not like as terrible as some of the other cards featured here, but I can't really see a situation where this would actually be useful over something like a Waboku, especially given that there are like board wipes in this format. This just seems pretty bad. Actually, I just thought of a kind of neat combo that you can pull off with this. If you change of heart an opponent's monster and equip it with Ring of Magnetism, then it will basically be decreasing that monster's attack and defense by 500. Kind of funny. I think it's too much investment just for that small of a benefit, but you could do it. You know, it's there. I mean, it's a potential use. Moving on to a bit more of an interesting card, even if it's not very good, we've got Soul Release. So Soul Release says target up to 5 cards in any graveyards, banish them. The reason I find this interesting is that this is basically a straight up power creep of a card called Gravedigger's Ghoul, which was basically banish 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard. So this is just a much better card in general. You can target any type of card instead of just monsters, which means that you can take out powerful spells or traps that your opponent could get back with Magician of Faith or Mask of Darkness. You can target monsters and spells and traps in your own graveyard, although I'm not sure why you would at this point in the game. It's just very interesting to see like a straight up power creep of one of the cards in the first set this early on. However, I think this is just a bit too niche for most scenarios. I guess you could side it in against control decks that are relying heavily on Magician of Faith or Mask of Darkness. But I think outside of that, you know, it's not very useful. And even in those games, it's kind of not the best because it really depends on what your opponent has in grave, you know. And also when you draw it, you might just, like, if you draw it at the wrong time, it's just kind of useless. And now for the last of these, like, why was this ever printed card? Who thought this was a good idea? We have probably the most baffling card of all, the Cheerful Coffin. It's a very simple card. It just says discard up to 3 monster cards from your hand to the graveyard. That's it. No plus side to that, just discarding monsters. I mean, it's really tough to see a scenario where you'd actually want to use this card. The only thing that I could come up with, well, actually, I guess there are 2 things that I could come up with, but the other reason I'd see maybe playing this is if, one, you want to go into a Monster Reborn sort of thing. So you Cheerful Coffin away the monster that you want to reborn, and then you reborn it. So I guess that's something. Or 2, you have Shadow Ghoul, or playing a Shadow Ghoul deck and want to buff its attack by 300 points. Both of those scenarios I don't think justify playing the Cheerful Coffin. They're both incredibly niche, and in the Shadow Ghoul situation, I don't actually think it's that good. You could play Reinforcements. It's not a permanent buff with Reinforcements, but I mean, I don't know. It just seems pretty bad. So, Cheerful Coffin, potentially the worst card in this set, even given some of the other terrible, terrible cards that we've covered in this section. Potentially the worst card in this set. And that will do it for the new cards that Metal Raider introduces. Metal Raiders is a huge set, so, I mean, this video has been very, very long, and I don't want to keep you for too much longer. But now that I've covered all these new cards and some of the new strategies that they introduce, I want to quickly revisit the older strategies from Yugi-Kaiba format and see how they shape up in this format, whether they're viable or not. So, of course, you know, most popular deck of last format is Soul Control. Soul Control is just a strategy that basically uses summon skulls, soul exchanges to clear away your opponent's monsters, get big monsters on the board, and, you know, play the long, steady game of just board advantage and big monsters. I think that Soul Control has gotten a lot worse in this format, especially given that there are other forms of removal, like Tribute to the Doomed, that don't cost you a battle phase. That being said, I think that it also receives some tools that kind of improve aspects of it. Thunder Dragon makes it so that you can more likely have a Soul Exchange target online, especially given that Thunder Dragon can be searched with something like Witch of the Black Forest. Share the Pain comboed with Soul Exchange is just destroy 2 of your opponent's monsters, basically. So that combo is kind of sick. So I definitely see Soul Exchange decks like having a place in this format. I think they're far less good than they were last format. Like, I definitely don't think they're tier 1 anymore. But I could see the strategy having some viable edges over certain other strategies. So I will be tinkering with this deck a little bit and see if it can actually translate well to this format. Next up, we've got Stall Mill, which I think both got some major upgrades and also some major downgrades. Firstly, I think that the opponent's deck is likely to be a lot thinner because they're searching it with like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest and things like that. So, you know, you're more easily able probably to pull off your combo. In addition, Magician of Faith being able to get back card destruction can be pretty good if you can pull that off. Just more ways to have your opponent discard their hand. And using things like Bistro Butcher can buff up their hand size to make just these incredibly devastating card destructions. That being said, the deck also suffers from a lot of the new cards that are introduced. Heavy Storm is just incredibly good against a lot of different stall decks, even if you can use something like Fake Trap to protect your Ultimate Offering and other trap cards to help your stalling strategy a bit more. I think that Heavy Storms just really mess this up and make it a lot harder to actually pull off your win condition. In addition, burn strategy is getting a bit better. Gives decks other ways to inflict more damage to you that can just kill you out of nowhere. And since you're trying to draw the game out for such a long time, I think that the Stall Mill can really suffer from that. So do I think the deck is abjectly terrible now? No, I think it's still like okay. However, I do think the deck is a lot worse than it was in Yugi-Kaiba. And I think it's probably similar to Soul Control, probably in like tier 2 or so. Maybe even lower. What about my favorite deck of last format, Worm Control, or Ultimate Offering Control, as it should probably be more accurately known? Well, Worm is a lot worse of a card in this format. Soul Exchange is nowhere near as relevant as it was in Yugi-Kaiba, which decreases a lot of Worm's like reason for being in the deck. Also, leaving your board empty when Masked Sorcerer and White Magical Hat exist can just be devastating. So I think that Wicked Worm Beast is not the best. I mean, I guess it can combo with Muka Muka a little bit, but it's just not very good, especially when Heavy Storm exists to deal with Ultimate Offerings and the like. I think that Fake Trap does, you know, mitigate that threat a bit, like I mentioned for Stall Mill. It can make your Ultimate Offerings more sturdy. And maybe the deck just pivoting to more of an Ultimate Offering control sort of strategy could work, just protecting the Ultimate Offerings with Fake Traps and potentially things like Solemn Judgments or Magic Jammers, and bringing out monsters during your opponent's battle phase, bringing out a bunch of monsters to attack in, you know, during your turn. It could work, but I think it's a lot harder of a sell here. And so I think that this is honestly just like, you know, probably rogue at best, probably in the trash tier, honestly. But I will experiment with it, see if there's any way to salvage this sort of deck idea. And it'll be interesting to see. What about Last Will Turbo? Well, Last Will Turbo is interesting because I think that it just ceases to be. It gets absorbed into other decks because Last Will becomes a lot better to play given things like Sangan or Masked Sorcerer or Witch. Just low attack monsters that can actually get a lot of value for you. So like Last Will just gets incorporated into things like Control, which, you know, I guess you could do a control deck running 3 Last Wills, but I'm not sure I'd call that Last Will Turbo. I think I'd just call that a control deck running 3 Last Wills. So while Last Will is a card doesn't go away in terms of relevance, I think Last Will Turbo as a deck idea does. If you want to think of some control decks as an extension of Last Will Turbo, you can definitely do this. But I personally won't be calling any decks on the channel Last Will Turbo in Critter format, at least in the near future. You know, maybe someone makes a deck that's just really Last Will Turbo, and it's like, wow, okay, you know, this deserves to be called Last Will Turbo. But I think that most decks running 3 Last Wills are just going to be called Control. Now we get to Exodia. Where does Exodia fall on the scale of things? We know that Stall Mills' star has fallen a lot because of things like Heavy Storm and the like. So you'd think Exodia, which was worse than Stall Mill last format, is going to be even worse this format, right? Well, you might think that, but Exodia is actually arguably one of the best decks in this format, which may seem shocking, but makes a lot of sense, you know? You can search a lot of Exodia pieces with things like Witch or Sangan, and you can bring out those monsters easily with things like Last Will. Thunder Dragon decreases the amount of cards in your deck effectively, increasing your consistency. You can tribute over your recruiters with Thunder Dragons to search more pieces. Mass Sorcerer can draw you more cards potentially. Like, Exodia has a lot of tools to either draw deeper or search harder. And that just makes it super, super good in this format. And it actually won the latest Critter tournament that was held, which is really cool to see a deck like this win. So I definitely will be showing off this deck more on the channel in the future. But Exodia is, I think, like tier 1 potentially. Maybe when more people adapt to it and feature more main decks outs to it, it will get worse. But I think that this is one of the best decks in the format as things stand now. Okay, what about the tribal decks from last format? Now, I mentioned this before when talking about Jank strategies, but I don't think tribal is very good this format. Sure, it does get monsters that boost up attributes, but I think given that there are just equip spells that outclass those buffs, like sort of Deep-Seated, Stim Pack, I think the tribal is just not good. There's not enough advantage to playing this sort of attribute-based or type-based deck, especially when, you know, Jirai Gumo exists, right? And Jirai Gumo can outclass pretty much anything, even equipped with like an Invigoration or a Sword of Dark Destruction. So, you know, I think that tribal strategies have just fallen into like trash tier in this format, where they're basically, you can play them, but they're not going to do anything for you. Maybe I'll be proven wrong in tinkering with them a bit. I am going to give tribal an honest shake in this format, but I don't have hopes for it. Next up, we've got dragons. How do dragons fare? Well, dragons are interesting. Dragons, I think every format that they're potentially relevant in, they're always so tantalizing, right? Like, it feels like you're so close to breaking them. And I do think that some of the cards in this set do get closer to that goal. You know, Sangan and Witch can both search out Lord of D, which is very nice. You can use things like Solemn Judgment to protect your monsters from threats. Like, I mean, if you summon out Lord of D and they try Trap Holing, you can Solemn Judgment that, keep Lord of D on field. Heavy Storm can clear away your opponent's back row before you set up the turn of summoning Lord of D and then Flute Summoning Dragon out things. I think that this deck has a lot more potential this format tentatively than in last format. It just remains to be seen whether it can actually outperform the more controlling decks that have risen to prominence, because it still does have to draw into some unsearchable cards like the Blue Eyes or the Flutes, and maybe that will require shifting more into Curse of Dragons or other sorts of dragons like that. Only time and experimentation will tell. And lastly, we have back row control. Now, I mentioned this before, but I think back row control is just pretty bad this format, right? Heavy Storm means that you don't actually need to know what your opponent has in the back row. You can just destroy it anyways, right? And with Heavy Storm and things like Magician of Faith to recycle it potentially, I mean, you don't need things like Dispel or Trap Master or any of those more specific, just one-for-one spell and trap removal tools. So I think back row control is kind of dead in the water, but Maybe I'll be proven wrong at some point. I'm planning on, like, even if I don't show off videos for each one of these, I'm planning on trying to see what I can do in bringing them to this format and seeing if they actually do anything. I doubt this is the case. I likely won't even get past the deck building stage for testing any of these ideas out, but it'll be interesting to see. Now, before I end this already incredibly long video, and thank you for staying with me for as long as you did. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it. Before I wrap everything up, I just want to show off some example decks in this format. The decks that I'm going to show off come from the top players of some of the past tournaments that have been held in Critter format, and I think they're all pretty neat and just provide you with some example deck lists if you want to just hit the ground running in this format before I actually show off some videos specifically related to those decks. The first deck that I want to show off is Jazz's Mass Control deck list from the most recent Critter format that was held on the format library. Now, if you watch some of my Yugi-Kaiba videos, then you know that Jazz is a very good duelist in a lot of different formats, and the sort of like standard soul control list that I featured in my Yugi-Kaiba guide was also of their creation. So this, just like that, is an extremely good example of one of the most popular decks in the format. As you can see, you know, they're on 3 Masked Sorcerer, which is what makes this the Masked Control part of the deck. They're on a White Magical Hat if they need to search it out with Sangans or Witches, of which they're playing 2 each. They're on Magician of Faith to get back their powerful spell cards. They are on Cannon Soldier to get in that last bit of damage potentially. They're on, you know, a 7-colored fish and 3 Lodgin as some good beaters. And they also have a defender in the form of Giant Soldier of Stone. For the spells, they're of course playing the Power 5, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Pot of Greed, Raigeki Monster Reborn. They're also playing 3 Fisher to act as more removal. 2 Heavy Storm, of course, because it's just crazy. They're also playing 2 Last Will to bring out, like, their Masked Sorcerers, their Sangans, their Witches, their White Magical Hats, and even potentially their Cannon Soldiers as well. Also, Cannon Soldier into Last Will is a very good combo. If you summon Cannon Soldier, tribute it off for its effect, Last Will out like a Masked Sorcerer, that can be pretty big. So Last Will is pretty good in this deck. And they're also playing 2 Swords of the Dying Light. As I mentioned before, you know, Swords has gotten a bit worse because Heavy exists, but it's still a pretty good card. For the traps, they're playing a Mirror Force, 3 Solemn Judgment to just control what their opponent does, 3 Trap Hole to destroy monsters that the opponent brings out, potentially to get over Masked Sorcerer, and 3 Waboku to protect their monsters and their life points. The side deck has a couple different side deck options. You know, it has card destructions for dealing with Exodia decks. It has Jirai Gumo if it wants to get a bit more aggressive. You know, Princess of Tsurugi if it wants to burn. Robin Goblin if it wants to go more on discard. A bunch of different things here that can be pretty good. But this is a pretty typical Masked Control list, although, that being said, given the wide variety of tools that control decks have available to them, there's no real one standard control list. There's a lot of variation even in the specific Masked Control sort of category. So while I'm putting this forward because it was the most recent, highest placing list for this deck, it isn't by no means the end-all be-all. So feel free to customize this how you please. The next deck I want to show off is one of the more aggro burn strategies that I mentioned earlier, which has been known as Cannon Burn. This is Fusion's Cannon Burn list from not the most recent tournament that was held in Critter, but the second most recent. And this is a very cool list if you're looking to go the aggro route. Of course, it's playing 3 7-colored fish, 3 Lodgin, just incredibly powerful beaters. Without downsides, it's playing 2 Dark Elf and 3 Jirai Gumo to get the really big beaters out. And also, it's playing 2 Witch of the Black Forest because most of the monsters in the deck cannot be searched with Sangan, so no Sangan, but Witch can search pretty much all of them. Cannon Soldier are also really nice to inflict that last bit of damage at the end of the game. And also Tremendous Fires are in there for that purpose as well. Speaking of spells, of course, it's got the Power 5, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki. It's got 2 Heavy Storms, of course, 3 Fissure to activate even more removal, 2 Swords Veering Light to potentially stall, and again, even though Heavy Storm's in the form, this is still a pretty good card. It's also playing a Mirror Force because that card's pretty good. It's playing 3 7 Tools of the Bandit instead of things like Solemn Judgment, and I think the reason for this is that this deck mainly cares about the opponent's trap cards. It doesn't really care as much about the spell cards that they're activating or the monsters that they're summoning out. So 7 Tools of the Bandit is going to be more relevant most of the time. And also, like, it's only 1,000 life points as opposed to Solemn Judgment. And in a deck that's playing Dark Elves and Jirai Gumo, you don't want to get too low too quick. So that's why I think the 7 Tools of the Bandit are here. I think it's a really heads-up inclusion by Fusion, and it's very cool and very good for this sort of deck. It's also playing 3 Trap Hold and 3 Wabokus as well, just standard great traps in the format. And for the side deck, it's got a couple different options. It's got Tsurugi for decks that play a lot more back row. It's got some Sangans to search out Tsurugis and many of your bugs potentially. Tribute to the Doomed if it needs more removal. Dispel against, swords, if it needs it. And then some Solemn Judgments as well. And lastly, the deck that topped the most recent Critter format, won the entire thing. We have Paolo NS's Exodia deck. I think it really took the Critter community by storm when it was first being tested out and played and revealed and all that stuff. But this deck is really, really cool. And it just cements Exodia as one of the best decks in the format. Of course, the win condition of the deck game 1 is Exodia. You've got Exodia the Forbidden One and all the little pieces. And just like a standard stall deck, it's also playing a fair amount of Defenders, Aquamador, 3 Giant Soldier of Stone. It's also playing 2 Witch and 2 Sangan to search out the pieces mainly. It can also search out like Mask of Darkness or Magician of Faith if you really need it. But these are the main win conditions of the deck. These get you to Exodia. It's also playing 3 Thunder Dragon, which is a really cool inclusion because you can use Thunder Dragon to tribute over a Recruiter to trigger it and get a Exodia piece back to hand. So that's really cool. It also, of course, the Magician of Faith and Master of Darkness can get back super powerful spell cards, like, for instance, Solemn Judgment, if you're worried about what your opponent might do, Mirror Force, potentially like a Reborn to Reborn back, again, like a Sangan or a Witch to get another search. There's just so many different ways that this deck has to trigger these Sangan and Witch searches to get pieces. And of course, speaking of those, for the spells, we've got Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Fissure, 2 Lost Will, a Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, Swords Revealing Light. Nothing too surprising here. Lost Will can get out the Recruiters. We're playing all the Power 5 spells, of course. And, there's just not the deck space to include more than 1 Fissure. But the 1 Fissure here is great removal. For the traps, of course, 1 Mirror Force, crazy card. 3 Solemn Judgment, very good in a sort of control-y, stall-y deck like this. 3 Trap Hole, great at stopping your opponent's monsters. 3 Uboku, great at preserving your life. And, of course, for the side deck, it's a bit of a smokescreen side, because after game 1 with Exodia, your opponent can just side in like card destructions or more white magical hats. But game 2 sides off that into a bit of a more aggressive strategy. 3 7-colored fish, 3 Lodgin, 2 Masked Sorcerer to add the mass control aspect to things, another Magician of Faith to get back more power spells, Cannon Soldier to add a bit more burn to the end of the game, 2 Fishers of more removal, Heavy Storm to clear away the opponent's spells and traps. The deck didn't need it game 1 when it's trying to build to Exodia, but game 2 and potentially 3 when it's trying to get in for a bit more damage, it's going to include the Heavy Storms to clear away the back row, and also a Robin Goblin to potentially get in for a bit of hand control. And I think like a deck like this shows how cool Critter format can be with the inclusion of just really cool effect monsters that completely change the game. So I hope you enjoyed this sort of guide to the card pool and some very powerful decks in critter format. There's still a lot more to dive into here, and I'll be featuring regular, duel videos in critter format with me playing some of these decks and strategies and showing off the ins and outs of this format. So I'm excited to dive into that. It should be really fun. And if you enjoy that sort of content, please be sure to, well, first of all, like this video and also subscribe to the channel so that way you never miss one of my critter duels that will be going up. But this video has been long enough already. Thank you for those who have stuck around to the end. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.